there. So welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Professor Cass Sunstein. Currently, he serves as the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard University, Professor of Law at Harvard University. His scholarly contributions include constitutional law, administrative law, environmental law, and behavioral economics. He's best known perhaps for his pioneering work on the concept of nudging, a term popularized by his best-selling book, Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness, co-authored with Richard Thaler, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics. Beyond his academic accomplishments, Professor Sunstein has also played a significant role in public service. He served as the administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs under President Obama, where he worked to improve regulatory processes and to promote evidence-based policymaking. Welcome, Cass.
Thank you so much. Okay, here's Hayek. Some words that should be more famous than they are. In no system that could be rationally defended would the state do nothing. An effective competitive system needs an intelligently designed and continuously adjusted legal framework as much as any other. Even the most essential prerequisite of its proper functioning, the prevention of fraud and deception, including exploitation of ignorance, provides a great and yet by no means fully accomplished object of legislative activity. That's Hayek. My goal is going to be to explore a form of classical liberalism that takes on board the core findings of behavioral economics. If I fail in achieving that goal, at least I am hoping that the form of liberalism that I will be exploring maintains the commitment to agency that defines the liberal tradition. How should we think about regulation when we know that people lack information, see Hayek, or suffer from behavioral biases? That's my question. And my answer is, here's how. Let's start with some basics that may be familiar. Hayek claims that the price system is a system of telecommunications which enables individual producers to watch merely the movement of a few pointers. He describes this process as a marvel. On his account, the price system is an extraordinary device for capturing collective intelligence, in part because it collects what everyone knows, and in part because it imposes the right incentives. We could agree with Hayek's arguments in the Uses of Knowledge in Society paper, while also thinking that certain forms of regulation are liberal and within bounds. In fact, Hayek thought that. Here are his words. Probably nothing has done as much harm to the liberal cause as the wooden insistence on some liberals on the principle of laissez-faire. Hayek did not choose his words carelessly, and it is worth pausing over that claim. Or consider these words: to prohibit the use of certain poisonous substances, or to require special precautions in their use, to limit working hours, or to require certain sanitary arrangements is fully compatible with the preservation of competition. Here we see an emphasis on externalities, asymmetrical information, and maybe a kind of paternalism. In Hayek's view, the only question here is whether, in the particular instance, the advantages gained are greater than the social costs that they impose. That's not the most poetic sentence ever written by a classical liberal, but I love it dearly because it's an embrace of cost-benefit analysis as the regulatory foundation. Focused on coercion, Hayek didn't show a lot of enthusiasm for paternalism, and while he didn't discuss it as such, his work on liberty can easily be read to stand against it. Coercion is evil precisely because it thus eliminates an individual as a thinking and valuing person and makes him a bare tool in the achievement of the ends of another. That is a staggeringly Kantian formulation, not speaking of welfare at all. Notice the use of the word evil and the objection to treating people as means rather than ends. And indeed, Hayek seemed at some points to embrace something like a non-welfarist Kantian foundation for freedom. He wrote, "Some readers will perhaps be disturbed by the impression that I don't take the value of individual liberty as an indisputable ethical presupposition, and that in trying to demonstrate its value, I am possibly making the argument in its support a matter of expediency." That would be a misunderstanding, Hayek adds, sounding Kantian. At certain points, though, Hayek extended his epistemic argument in favor of markets to make a claim not rooted in an ethical predisposition, but in welfarism. Consider his suggestion that the awareness of our irremediable ignorance of most of what is known to somebody, the chooser, is the chief basis of the argument for liberty. If it appears that the market mechanism leads to an effective utilization of more knowledge than any directing agency can possess, this is the chief foundation of the case for economic freedom. That's a claim about a problem that besets outsiders and planners. Hayek says at one point that the argument for liberty, his most cherished ideal, involves the absence of omniscient men. Indeed, he writes, if there were such men, we would be able to offer, quote, little case for liberty. I disagree with that view for multiple reasons, and some of them Kantian, and I doubt that Hayek really believed it. But let's not be detained by that point here. Okay, emphasizing the occasional humanity to blunder, a lot of people have been asking whether mandates and bans have a fresh welfarist justification. Some of the answers, though offered by liberals, seem profoundly anti-Hayekian. Because coercion is involved, they might well be taken on Hayekian premises to be indefensible abridgments of liberty. But if we know that people's choices lead them in the wrong direction and put no in bold letters, why should we insist on freedom of choice? In the face of human error, is it odd or even perverse to insist on that form of freedom? Recall here Hayek sounding more Benthamite than Kantian and insisting on the relationship between omniscience and its absence and freedom. No one should doubt that in some cases choosers lack relevant information. Hayek emphasized that point in defending government information campaigns. Thus, here's Hayek, where most individuals do not even know that there is useful knowledge available and worth paying for, it will often be an advantageous investment for the community to bear some of the costs of spreading such knowledge. We all have an interest in our fellow citizens being put in a position to choose wisely, bracket that, and put it in large font. And if some have not yet awakened to the possibilities which technological developments offer, a comparatively small outlay may be often sufficient to induce individuals to advance further on their own initiative. Is Hayek endorsing a form of nudging? No doubt about it. Let's note that people might not choose wisely, per Hayek, because they lack information, because they suffer from unrealistic optimism, because they suffer from present bias, neglecting the long term, because they show limited attention, because of cognitive scarcity perhaps, or because they suffer from availability bias and thus are complacent about some risks and are hysterical about others. Okay, we have to emphasize that planners might claim to find a behavioral bias when there isn't one. They might have bad incentives of their own. They might seem subject, and of course they are, to behavioral biases. Still, a corrective response would seem to be on the table, even on liberal premises, emphasizing Hayek's welfarist face and also emphasizing the point about absence of information. If there is such a thing as liberal behavioral economics, and I'm going to get to the punchline very soon, I promise, it would firmly reject the view that public officials should be content to identify individual errors and declare victories. An approach with liberal roots should engage in a comparative analysis, how costly are individual errors compared with the errors that would be introduced by corrective efforts. To answer that, we need to know something about the relevant institutions. If a decision is made to proceed with some kind of remedy, and here's the punchline, a liberal approach rooted in both Kantian and utilitarian thinking might try to reduce the knowledge problem by asking what individuals would do under epistemically favorable conditions. So that's the punchline. A liberal system of regulation, which might be content with nudges, which might consider mandates and bans, would try to reduce the problem by focusing not on what do planners want, but on what do we know about what individual choosers actually do under epistemically favorable conditions. I think Hayek himself, if we were to have a time machine and ask him, would say, good luck with that. And the enterprise of asking what individual choosers would do under epistemically favorable conditions is a road to serfdom. But I want to urge that in 2024, the good luck with that question is no longer rhetorical, because a stream of research is asking exactly that question, not by planners consulting their intuitions, but by researchers asking five subsidiary questions, which are in principle and often in practice answerable. Question number one, what do consistent choosers, unaffected by clearly irrelevant factors or frames, choose? So do people choose, for example, automatic enrollment in single-sided printing, regardless of whether the default is for single-sided or double-sided? If we know that people consistently choose single-sided, we know something about what people choose unaffected by the default. What do informed choosers choose? If people have information about some characteristic of a product, do they consistently choose product X over product Y? Is it the uninformed choosers who flip from one to another, or maybe who choose product Y because we know of their lack of information? What do active choosers choose? If we focus on active choosers, we will protect against the possibility that outcomes are a product of inertia or procrastination. If people's view screen is broad and they don't suffer from limited attention, what is it that they're choosing? That's related to the question of what do people choose under conditions of full information. In circumstances, the fifth question, in which people are free of, say, present bias or unrealistic optimism, what do they choose? It might be empirically challenging to figure out what those circumstances are, but there's work from Stanford's own Hunt Alcott that goes a long way towards giving us some answers to those questions. Okay, just in principle, the best approach and the liberal one would be for choice architects to ask all five of these questions. Active choosers who are uninformed might blunder. The same is true of informed choosers who procrastinate or suffer from inertia. If we learn what informed, consistent, and active choosers, uninfluenced by limited attention or present bias, choose, we might have real guidance. All of the questions can be answered empirically, and what we might call liberal behavioral economics is trying to do exactly that. I should say it's serendipitous that Stanford's Alcott and Stanford's Bernheim are engaged in these enterprises. Of course, there might be heterogeneity in the relevant population, making it hard to generalize from what some part does. But suppose there isn't a whole lot of heterogeneity. In principle and sometimes in practice, efforts to answer the subsidiary question should help with the welfare analysis, where it's often hard to know how to proceed where behavioral findings cast out unstandard uses of revealed preferences. And in fact, efforts to answer the subsidiary questions might justify some sort of regulatory response, not because, let's profoundly hope, regulators like responses in the abstract, but because they're building on the choices of the right choosers. Okay, this has been a bit abstract. I'm suggesting that a liberal behavioral economics would not ask, what does the planner think best, but would ask, what do choosers actually choose under epistemically favorable conditions? We might, for second order reasons, think that that's a horrifying question to ask because we don't trust the knowledge or incentives of those who seek to answer it. But we might think that in a system with at least pretty well functioning institutions, asking that question can direct choice architects to do something welfare promoting that doesn't compromise individual agency. Okay, that might justify, let's say, responses that are in the nature of nudges, choice-preserving interventions that are justified on classical liberal grounds and not on other grounds. I'm going to now go to a very unfavorable territory, the territory of mandates, the treacherous territory of mandates. And I'm going to explore the possibility of defending such mandates as opposed to economic incentives by reference to behavioral market failures. The more general goal is to ask whether such mandates might reduce internalities, understood as the cost that choosers impose on their future selves. And I'm going to intend the issue of fuel economy mandates to be exemplary. A similar analysis might be made of cigarette taxes, taxes on soda-sweetened beverages, savings policy, and many other problems, highway safety issues too. And what we're going to explore is externalities and internalities, and asking, without answering with an exclamation point, but with a kind of whispered yes, the question whether on broadly liberal grounds the argument for mandates might be convincing under certain empirical assumptions. Okay, let's note to motivate this that fuel economy mandates, they're very much in the news now, something very controversial came from the Biden administration. They might, involving electric cars and hybrids, note that they might simultaneously reduce externalities and internalities. On familiar assumptions, mandates have much lower net benefits than carbon taxes. And the reason is that carbon taxes are a much more efficient response to the externalities produced by motor vehicles. Fuel economy standards compared to optimal corrective taxes are a horrible loser. I don't want to run the numbers or reach a final conclusion, but suggest first that mandates might turn out to be justified on welfare grounds. Second, that the standard economic preference for economic incentives misses something of importance. And third, that a liberal or even Hayekian approach allows us to make some progress in assessing the first two claims. Okay, it's clear that motor vehicles emit pollution, including greenhouse gases, and there's an assortment of externalities associated with them. Hayek says, nor can certain harmful effects of deforestation or of some methods of farming or of the smoke and noise of factories be confined to the owner in question. To the owner of the property in question or those who are willing to submit to the damage for an agreed compensation, sounding here like both Pigou and Coase. In such circumstances, Hayek says, we must find substitute for the regulation by the price system. Whoa. With greenhouse gases, we're dealing something very similar to the smoke and noise of factories. On broadly liberal grounds, a cap and trade system or a corrective tax is the best response. It ensures that drivers internalize the social costs of their activities. The cap and trade system and corrective taxes allow for competition and leave the private sector with a lot of flexibility. They can find their own means to the chosen goal. They can compete over means, and competition is a familiar discovery system. So the choice between cap and trade and carbon taxes raise a host of important questions, but they're really second-order questions here. Let's look now at fuel economy standards, which don't just reduce externalities, but also reduce internalities. That is the cost people impose on their future selves. The problem is on, let's say, classical liberal grounds, we need to repeat the word, it's not at all clear that the consumer benefit should count in the analysis. In deciding which cars to buy, consumers can certainly take account of the private savings, and they do. If they choose not to buy such cars, it's because they don't value fuel efficiency as compared to other vehicle attributes. Where on earth is the market failure? The US government, invoking behavioral findings, has said the market failure is a behavioral one. And here the claim is that consumers under epistemically unfavorable conditions make demonstrably poor choices given their own self-interest. And here's what the US government has said. This is the energy paradox. Consumers appear not to purchase products that are their economic self-interest. There are strong theoretical reasons why this might be so. It's the US government. Consumers might be myopic and hence undervalue the long term. That's present bias. Consumers might lack information, or they might lack a full appreciation of information even when it is presented. That's about salience. Consumers might be especially averse to the short-term losses associated with the higher prices of energy efficiency products relative to future fuel savings, the behavioral phenomenon of loss aversion. Even if consumers have relevant knowledge, the benefits might not be sufficiently salient to them. Calling out the work on salience from David Leibson and others. We should be really cautious before accepting these arguments. Hayek was skeptical of reliance on the wisdom of experts. Quote, "One thing, in fact, which the work on this book has taught me is that our freedom is threatened in many fields because of the fact that we are much too ready to leave to the decision to an expert or to accept too uncritically his opinion about a product problem of which he knows intimately only one aspect, fair. Behavioral biases have to be demonstrated, not simply asserted. Some research finds that with changes in gas prices, consumers do adjust their purchasing decisions, suggesting that they are highly attentive to fuel economy. There is evidence from Alcott finding that when aggressive steps are taken to inform consumers of fuel economy, call that a Hayekianly legitimate response, they don't choose different vehicles, which suggests that a lack of information is not a causal factor. Still, the government's numbers finding no consumer welfare loss from fuel economy support the suggestion that customers are serving from some kind of behavioral bias. Maybe the government's numbers are wrong, but there's a lot of data supportive of the government's speculation that present bias and an absence of salience are relevant. Okay, I'm having like the equivalent of 3 cheers for behaviorally informed choice-preserving responses and a cautious 2.5 cheers for at least the plausibility of fuel economy standards made by reference to behavioral market failures and internalities in particular. The broader point is, can we have an analysis of regulation that can claim full-throatedly to be liberal and maybe with fear and trembling to be Hayekian? In view of Hayek's skepticism about coercion and top-down expertise, any confident answer would not be warranted, but return to the questions with which I began. At least in the first instance, and maybe in the last, behaviorally informed liberal policy ought to be based not on the preferences and values of social planners, but are on learning from the choices of informed and unbiased choosers. Maybe we can identify those choices. If we have done so, we might be on the road toward identifying appropriate interventions, whether they involve nudges, taxes, subsidies, or mandates. It would be extravagant to claim that those interventions, defended by reference to people's choices under epistemically favorable conditions, are Hayekian. But it may not be extravagant to say that they are in Hayek's general spirit and respectful of his most fundamental concerns. They certainly, those responses, that is, count as liberal. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Sunstein. We have a question by David and another question by Dan.
Thanks, Cass. We spoke on the phone once when I was doing a review of one of your books. You did mention the issue of the incentives of the bureaucrats and the politicians and so on. I want to just push a little in that direction. I mean, I'll go back to fuel economy in a minute, but one of the biggest things we see in our political system is Social Security and the problems with it. And it seems to me the people who put Social Security together are the ones who are incredibly myopic because they aren't in power for very long. And it takes a huge decision about saving. I mean, 12.4% of people's income up to some level away from them. And so that's the first thing I want to put on the table. The second thing is, well, you can certainly conceive of a bureaucrat who thinks the way you do, putting these standards in. Look at what's happening with EVs when both major candidates for president want a huge tariff on cheap EVs, which suggests that there's a lot more going on than people just choosing these Piagovian, Coasian, Hayekian, whatever you call them, standards.
Okay, that's great. So let's talk about fuel economy standards. So for 4 years, I was a bureaucrat and a Senate confirmed bureaucrat. So I had a political, and even I'm speaking my academic capacity now, but I'm a bureaucrat much of the time now in the Department of Homeland Security. So the fuel economy choices I saw close up in the first round. Now, what was in the cost benefit analysis was front and center. It wasn't everything, but it was fundamental. Now, was that a historical anomaly? Don't know, but let's notice at least that the difference between the Trump fuel economy standards and the Obama fuel economy standards, while quite significant, it wasn't like this. And I think it's that I'm going to say that if Trump's fuel economy standards had been, extremely deregulatory as opposed to significantly deregulatory, it would have been very challenging to justify on cost benefit grounds. I think they would have had to reject the consumer savings entirely, which wouldn't have been a crazy thing to do, but given where the data is, it would have been hard. Think. So, and as I observe the bureaucrats close up, at least in my, very partial runs, they're very attentive to the considerations we're now discussing. Now, on the tariffs, I don't have a lot to say. Of course, you're right. There's tension between a very pro-EV policy and high tariffs on electric vehicles. And whether we can make sense of that, unclear. On the basic point, we might think that the incentives faced by politicians and bureaucrats are such that for second order reasons, we should take all this away from them. I get that. And I think old Hayek, as opposed to youngster Hayek, kind of moved in that direction. So the very pretty ample regulatory state stuff of the road to serfdom is less visible in his later work. Now, did he get more crotchety or did he get wiser?
I'm going for the former. I mean, the latter, sorry.
What you're saying is completely fair.
Yeah,
So what we could say at this point is, okay, Sunstein, we get it under certain assumptions about the band of bureaucrat incentive and error. What you've said is plausible, but I don't think those assumptions are right.
right. That's what I'm saying. Thank you.
That could be true. There's a world in which that's true. Is it our world? Maybe.
I think so, but thank you.
Done. Done, Clay. Unmute yourself, please.
Hi, thank you for your presentation, Professor Sunstein. It's nice to see you. Um, yeah, it sounds like you want to fashion your own outlook, which I'm not sure what that is, as classical liberal, and to do that, invoke Hayek and quote Hayek a great deal. I want to kind of ask you about Adam Smith. Now, I'm personally of the view that we were at our best in the 18th century. And I think that Hayek really at heart was groping towards human Smith. And Smith, I think, had a clearer and better approach to all the issues that you're dealing with, in that he talked about our having a relationship with our conscience, which he called the man within the breast, and which he also called the representative of the impartial spectator, which was God or a godlike being. The man within the breast is, as it were, God's vicegerent on the earth to watch your behavior. And in this relationship between you, as it were, your present conscious self all the time with your conscience, your man within the breast, you are learning and being guided to some extent, we hope in a friendly way, by your man within the breast, who also has to learn and who also is imperfect, um, about how to live better, how to be more virtuous. And it seems to me that the man within the breast, we ought to be speaking to people and people's man within the breast about all of the things that you have to teach. And that the important thing really is for people to learn by doing, which is to say, to learn how to listen to their man within the breast, and how and for their man within the breast to learn what is aligned with God's goodness by listening to Professor Sunstein and other such things. And again, it's learning by doing, just as Smith said in his first principle of the division of labor. We get better by doing. So I think that the whole approach that I've seen of behavioral economics and such, like, totally lacks this Smithian man within the breast, learn by doing, and that's actually the basis for the big presumption for autonomy. And it dissolves the consequentialist, deontological, or Kantian type of distinction, because what it's saying is that there's a very big concept. You need those two wings of ethics to do ethics properly. That's Smith. So what do you think of all that?
First, it's great to see you. So I have your books on my bookshelf, and I learned a ton from them. So I agree with what you said. I'm tempted to say, as John Rawls did in a footnote that he never published, we post a signpost, no deep thinking here. Things are bad enough already. So I'm tempted to, that's one of my reactions. I'm thinking the GPS device was lamented by many on the ground that it would make it hard for people to learn by doing. And the printing press was kind of historically, famously lamented by many, because once there were pages, people wouldn't learn by doing. They wouldn't learn, they wouldn't memorize text anymore. It'd just be all written down. And there's data suggesting that taxi drivers know roads less well because they're GPS devices. So I guess I'd say that the man within the breast, life is complicated, and there's a worker, let's suppose, on a construction site who faces multiple risks, and the man within the breast could be virtuous or could be informed, but there's cognitive scarcity for that worker. I'm hearing construction work outside my window. And for them to be informed about A, the hazards that they face, and B, what they can do to reduce those hazards is potentially a life slaver and not an insult to the men within the breast or their agency. So this is the very mundane reaction I have. Suppose you have a behaviorally focused occupational safety and health administration, which thinks of its job number one as to protect workers through nudges. That's good, a good thing. It could save lives, and if we're lucky, it's not going to cost a whole lot. Now, if we're going beyond that to have mandates, suppose you have silica, and let's just stipulate that the risk posed by silica in the workplace is really high, and it would be very hard to think that an informed person would take the trade-off that the economy offers. And you could inform the consumer, the worker a ton, but do you ban the exposure to silica over X? I say on plausible assumptions about the risk, absolutely. And the ban bracketing the second order reasons. They think the banners are random or have screwy incentives. So I think the proposition, every proposition you said, I'm completely for. But the idea that that would be like a knife that cuts through regulatory choices, that would be very surprising. On the Kantian versus welfarist, you could see a welfarist justification for, let's say, energy efficiency standards, where the benefits just crush the costs. But it might be objectionable on Kantian grounds because people aren't allowed to choose the refrigerators they want. That's why these kind of get pulled apart. And I think the man within the breast thing just it's not sufficiently robust to tell us what to do when we're deciding whether to have an energy efficiency rule.
I'm not presenting the man within the breast as some surefire solution, but I'm suggesting the man within the breast to say, once you think along those lines, it should bolster the presumption of liberty, because the man within the breast is people's main way of becoming good and virtuous and wise and pursuing life and enjoying life.
I agree. For my favorite liberal text is Mill's on Liberty, my personal favorite, and he's with you. So I agree with that. So what the first half of the remarks was trying to sketch the foundations for a set of liberty-producing interventions, nudges, information, automatic enrollment with easy, visible opt-out, with promoting people's agency to opt out if they don't like automatic enrollment, or automatic non-enrollment. And then I tried to sketch an argument for mandates that seems to be liberal, though I was very tentative about whether it's convincing.
Richard, Jeff, and Sarita.
Hi, Professor Sunstein. Thanks for taking the question. I wouldn't say there's a different set of assumptions. I would say perhaps maybe reframe it. There's an internal contradiction in the assumptions. That is, if people are biased and they never realize those biases and they can't be convinced of them, then the government official has to behave as an angel. Because if anything, the individual through a mandate thinks they're being made worse off. So you're asking politicians not only to be ignore their act counter to their interests.
Okay, let's talk about that. Thank you. So suppose there's a program that gives poor children access to free school meals, lunch and breakfast. And let's say the program is one that has a take-up rate of 40%. And then the government says, Houston, we have a problem. We have the majority of the beneficiary population isn't enrolled, and we can't see why it wouldn't be in their interest to be enrolled. It's free lunch and breakfast. And we think that the reason they're not enrolled is inertia, that to get enrolled, you have to fill out forms. That's our theory of the case. And what we're going to do is automatically enroll the families into free school meals and give them, my dogs just came, they have free non-school meals. You can see a tail, I think, in the air. Yes, that is my Labrador's tail. It's almost waiting. You can give them access to free school meals, and the suggestion is that they will not be sad or mad that they've been enrolled if your theory of the case that it's inertia is correct. And that's not hypothetical, that's real. The parents are directly certified, that's the term. And if they want to get out, they can get out. It's easy. And the percentage that gets out is really close to zero. And that's characteristic. Or if you have an educative nudge, which says, okay, this set of products has shrimp in them. If you have a shrimp allergy, probably better not eat it. And let's suppose the reason people benefit from that is either they lack information, or they have limited attention, or they're unrealistically optimistic. And so the universe of choice-preserving interventions, some of which are architectural, like automatic enrollment in free school meals, some of which are educative, like a warning or a label or a reminder, that they don't run afoul of your problem. So if you're reminded by, let's say, regulatory compulsion that you're going to have to pay your bill, or you're going to incur a late fee, and let's suppose the reason for that is a thought that people are inattentive, then people aren't saying, oh my God, what did you do to me? They're instead saying, oh, good, I know, I should probably pay up.
Yes.
So I take your point, if we had a nudge that people thought, why are you doing this to me? Either it's the wrong thing to do to them, and then it shouldn't be done, or they are, because of a behavioral bias, saying, why are you doing this to me? And then we need to figure out how to handle that. I don't know of any cases like that, by the way. There must be some.
So I would like to push harder along the lines that David was pushing. It seems very surprising to me that in formulating your argument, you pay so much attention to information and so little to incentives. In fact, you dismissed incentives at one point by saying, if we have well-functioning institutions, we won't worry about incentives. But it seems to me that everything you're advocating is deeply, deeply fraught with agency problems, trying to identify behavioral mistakes as opposed to preferences and sort out which are which, attempts to define what you called epistemically favorable conditions and what information sets these entail, attempts to identify the correct decisions under the epistemically favorable conditions, attempt to identify the right interventions. All of those seem to be deeply, deeply, fraught with agency problems and with incentive problems. And that strikes me maybe one can attempt to do these things, but that strikes me as the first order issue with all of these, attempts or things you want to do, and not information. And so I guess, one question is, why isn't your focus on incentives and all of the incentive problems and what we can do to overcome that? Why do you sort of brush that off to the side, either with well-functioning institutions, or your answer to David, you're optimistic that we can overcome these, and focus all your attention instead on information.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for that. So let me give the kind of low-key answer and then the high-key answer. The low-key answer is that I'm not dismissing any of those. I'm just bracketing them. So it's progress, I hope, to say under what assumptions would you want to do one sort of thing. And if you can say that under assumptions of well-functioning institutions, this is what you'd want to do, then that's better, I think, than just having a revolver, which has a word associated with it. It's called incentives, to any idea. The revolver approach is blockheaded, and the analytical approach says on assumptions of this sort, this is what you do. Assumptions of what you that's what you do. So we avoid blockheadedness, and we try to identify exactly why we're coming out where we are. That's the low key. I might have fooled you. That's the low key response. The high key response is that incentives and bureaucrats are dumb and self-interested. It's, I think, the first refuge of scoundrels. I encountered it a lot at the University of Chicago. It might be true, but it's much less true than those who tend to say it think. And it's not really academic. It's more like a radio talk show. So I want to avoid that. And my own observation, both of data and of performance, suggests that the bureaucrats are either dumb or have bad incentives. It's too cool for school, and it's 2024. It's not George Stigler's first year, and we're better than that.
Well, I mean, what I take from your answer is incentives are a cop-out. Let's focus on information. We have lots of, but we have lots and lots of very good models of incentives and lots of good ways to model and test and identify incentives and focus on that. And it seems like you've just chosen to focus on information rather than incentives. And to me, in order of magnitude, the incentives are more important than the information here.
No, I agree that that's very important. So to say on assumptions X and Y and Z, a minimum wage would be a really good idea is progress, even if there are facts that are highly relevant to the assessment of minimum wage that aren't captured in those things. So I completely agree with that. So if we want to say that the incentives of the Department of Transportation are such that the fuel economy enterprise is ill-conceived, go for it. Then we'd have a paper which would, then we'd know something. We'd know that assuming good incentives from the Department of Transportation, fuel economy standards would be justified on liberal grounds. That would be interesting. But given the incentives that the Department of Transportation faces, they aren't. Then we know a lot. So the claim that incentives crush information as a determinant of what government should do, that could be true. So I'm eager to read. I know the Department of Transportation. The Department of Transportation is a friend of mine. It's neither Dan Quayle nor John Kennedy, but the idea that their incentives are, I don't know, maximize, minimize. I mean, I think what we'd say is their incentive is to do something that's welfare promoting subject to political constraint. So it might be leadership is saying, don't go crazy here, kind of like markets, or leadership is saying, go bold here. We're very worried about climate change, but that would be an incentive. But I take your point. I mean, you're raising an important point, and it's just a project that's supplemental to the paper. You think it's much more important than the paper, and it's possible that's true.
Sarita and then Jonathan.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm at University of Virginia, by the way, in PPL, politics, philosophy, political philosophy, policy law, whatever it is. I don't know that I have anything brilliant to say, but I just have a few questions, more or less, to help me clarify what I think you're saying, but I want you to correct me if I'm wrong about it. And this actually goes to Jeffrey, what you were just talking about. So I'm trying to mull these ideas over. It seems, Professor Sunstein, as if you are saying, or you're implying that the state is, in fact, just as equipped, if not more so, in terms of information to be able to make various decisions that would impinge favorably upon individual citizens, not only welfare and well-being, but also their freedom on a certain level. And you are taking Hayek to task because Hayek has this one of his strongest points is that no central planner or no governmental mechanism can, in fact, have that level of information, et cetera, which is why I think the framing of your paper is so oriented toward this information issue. It seems to me that you're implying with all of these different examples about Thatcher's milk to the students and all that sort of thing, it seems to me as though you are implying that the government is essentially like a human actor, though, in the sense that what they don't know, they will discover through trial and error and experimentation. And in fact, the feedback that you get from citizens when something doesn't feel right, for instance, or whatever is tried by the government as a welfare initiative does not exactly land as a welfare initiative. And then the government says, oh, great, that's useful information. Let's try this a different way or something like that. It is kind of interesting because I think that you're granting a great deal of agency, not only to individual citizens, which I think you think is one of the biggest, if not the primary component of liberalism, but it's also giving agency to the government as essentially a group of actors who have possibly more information than regular citizens do on a whole host of different issues. I guess my question to you from a liberalism perspective, if that's what you're saying, is does that not, or don't you think that Hayek would say that creates a power asymmetry, though? That we have individuals who now have a burden to resist or a burden to respond and to react, but in fact, it shouldn't be a burden that they should have, I guess. And we have essentially one Leviathan-like agent in the state who is making various different knowledge experiments. But is that permissible from liberalism's standards for the way that individuals they interact and they clash with each other as individuals? But is this letting the state into that same playing field on that soccer field? Is that fair from a liberalism standpoint? And go ahead.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I'm not going to do as well as I should in response to this. So the claim of the remarks is actually more cautious than you stated. It's not that the government is in a better position than the citizens, but but stipulating that it is, what kind of inquiries does it make in deciding what to do? And so I take the previous questions to be saying that the stipulation is false, is wrong because of lack of information or incentives. I don't agree with that, but I haven't earned my disagreement. So let's back up a little bit. So Hayek himself, at least in The Road to Serfdom, was receptive to lots of government stuff. So if we want to talk about liberalism, there's a non-Hayekian Hayek who maybe looked closer to old Hayek, who's not the Hayek I'm talking about. So Hayek was very clear about a lack of information on the part of persons and urged that the government should expend resources to give people information. And Hayek was not nervous that that was exploiting a power dynamic or doing something welfare reducing or agency reducing. He was pro that. And I say on very plausible assumptions, that was correct. Hayek was also pro mandates in some quick sentences about the environment and saying the price mechanism wasn't enough, and also about dangerous working conditions where to identify the externalities more challenging. it seems like either an absence of information or I'd like to say behavioral bias, though that, of course, followed Hayek. Hayek was not keen on the rationality of individual choosers. That wasn't his thing. So Hayek's corpus is compatible, at least, with identifying departures from rationality on the part of individual choosers. So what do we do about that? The paper, if it says anything that's not out there, it collects, and I find this very exciting, work by Alcott and Bernheim and Leibson and others, which is liberal behavioral economics. It's very emphatic about the primacy of individual agency. And what does that give us openness for? It gives us openness for choice-preserving interventions, of which, information provision's the simplest, and automatic enrollment might be the least simple. And those are, saying if people don't like the direction in which they're being nudged, it's costless to say, I don't like that. And the GPS device preserves agency, both in allowing people to reject the direction suggested and in allowing people to specify their preferred destination. If they
But
want
that's only if rejecting it doesn't have forms, as you say. So it does seem as though if the initial problem is that they weren't signing on to certain things because it was odious to express that. You see what I'm saying? Why would there be no cost to report that you didn't like it?
Well, to opt out of a savings plan is easy, and a lot of people do it. To opt out in the Netherlands, people were automatically enrolled in organ donation. That's kind of an externality thing, might be information or inertia thing also, but a lot of people opted out. So whenever there's an opt-out right, there will be some people who opt out. The more provocative claim, we might, for second order reasons, rule internality correction through mandates off limits. And I completely get that. Ed Glazer has a very good paper on that. But the paper says if we're going to do mandates to correct internalities, what would be the theory of the case? And the theory of the case, I think, least contentiously is about information. More contentiously is if we know that choosers are suffering from a behavioral bias. So they're getting themselves sick or dead. And I'm thinking that there would be reasons to fear a government's lack of information or a government's incentives. But we don't want to use that as like an all-purpose argument, certainly against trying to get clearer on concepts and such. And I think also we don't want to use it too readily as I'm doing this on the fly, but the classical liberal revolver. It's too coarse. It might in the end be right, but it makes us a little less smart than we might otherwise be.
Jonathan and Eric.
Yeah, I want to pursue this line on incentives because I think, but a slightly different angle. Like Jeff, I'm worried about the incentive of the government, but there's another form of incentive we haven't spoken about, which is the incentive of the individual. The more the government makes decisions for individuals, the less incentive they have to make the individuals themselves. And before we know it, the government's making all the decisions, not just the decisions. And I think it's a pretty small set where the government knows more than the individual.
Okay, so the general point is not only fair, but correct. If we have a government that gives people warnings about peanuts and shrimp in certain foods, or that has a nutrition facts panel, the government isn't making decisions for people, it's helping people exercise their own agency. And it doesn't follow from a nutrition facts panel that we're going to ban meat eating. In fact, it might be just the opposite, that the people who like the nutrition facts panel are insistent on the primacy of individual agency. So I say a nutrition facts panel is a liberal intervention. and that it's not a road to serfdom. There are things, okay, this, to tell you if you find this ridiculous or helpful. People are automatically enrolled in savings plans. The government has incentivized that. It hasn't really mandated that, but it's incentivized that. They're incentivized to enroll in index funds that are highly diversified and passively managed, a combination of government stuff and private stuff. So you probably, many of the people on this call probably experience this. You're probably automatically enrolled in a passively managed, highly diversified index funds. And that means that people like my sister aren't studying optimal investment texts, and that's okay.
Well, I mean, what about showerheads? You can't get a decent showerhead in this country because they've decided there's a, limit. We're all better off with. I mean, at what point do you make the decision? That's slightly different because it's an externality, but there are various things. Where do you draw the line there? Where the government says, no, you have to be incentivized yourself to figure it out.
Well, I would say it's a net benefits calculation with a strong presumption in the case of non-externalities in favor of preserving individual choice. So, so long as there's not an externality, we want nothing, or which might be hard to come up with because there might be something nudgy in there, even from government, even if we call it nothing. But we want, if it's only an internality, strong presumption in favor of individual choice. But it might be we'd have an educative nudge, or it might be we'd have flip the default rule from opt-out to opt-in, or vice versa. So if people are automatically enrolled in some program, which gives them money, which they're legally entitled to, that's not an insult to their autonomy. Now, so I think we probably have the same framework, you and I, as you talk, which is you're very, this is an effort to, it would be shocking if liberalism as Hayek saw it or as Adam Smith saw it, it would be really sad, told us everything we need to know. And if we weren't better now, Bentham wrote this about tradition. He said, those people, they were like babies. That was the wisdom of the cradle. We're older. We know more.
We should know more anyway.
Eric Rasmussen.
I was just at the American Law and Economics Association conference in Ann Arbor. And I don't know if you know Jim Hines, but he's president and he ran a great conference. And I think I'd give him credit for this because at dinner, it's really noisy and I've got this cold I still have. And I was wanting some wine and they weren't bringing it around. And I realized his clever idea. It was unlimited wine and hard liquor, but you had to go back up and get another glass. So I did and others did, and a huge amount of money was saved from people not drinking wine who didn't really want it. Remember the overflow, the ever-filling soup bowl? Well, with wine, it works the same way. And I was thinking about an example and thinking also about the agency problem that Jeff talked about and actually that Jonathan was just now of government failure. And we've got it with the self too. And they've talked about internalities because I'm a bad agent for my future self, which I think is a huge problem for libertarians. Because a teenager is getting to choose for his 30-year-old self whether to be alive or dead, make all these very important decisions. He's hugely biased in favor of his present self. Having his father or even the mayor or somebody decide doesn't seem like as much of an infringement on personal liberty of this 30-year-old as having some 18-year-old guy who just happens to have the same name make the decision for him. So there's probably an information problem with that or the wine, partly poor information processing, but also an agency problem. And maybe that's what you're trying to sort things into, either with opt-in, opt-out, or I'm not sure which this was with the wine, cooling off periods, where we purposely imposed some extra costs, very strange, extra transactions costs, in the hopes of sorting out who really wants the wine and who doesn't.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you. So also, how come you look the same age as when I last saw you a long time ago? How did that happen? You're a good age.
Premature white beard. That's it.
No, you look exactly the same. So, so you're a good agent for your future self, your past self was. So, so I agree with exactly what you said, and I think it's important. It's consistent with some of the skeptical remarks, but it's a compliment with an E. So we might think that the government is a poor agent and inadequately informed, and you're adding that I have a son who's 15 years old. Is he a fantastic agent for his 30-year-old self? Does he have the information that's needed? And it may be there are things that are from the private sector, which are maybe more genial on classical liberal grounds, which are responsive to the concern you're identifying. Like, are you sure you want to? When people are trying to delete all their files or send a note to their spouse that they will regret. It says, are you sure you want to?
Yes.
So there's no agency. And I see some of government stuff to have an are you sure you want to quality, if only a warning that, here's a sunscreen you can get. It will protect you from burns, but it's not going to do anything for cancer. And there are nudges that are designed to get people to give careful consideration to whether they want to get a good tan only or if they want to get a cancer risk reduction sunscreen. And I'm for that. And I don't worry that the government that requires clarity on whether it's a tanning oil or a cancer risk reducing, that the government is thinking ridiculous thoughts or bowing to an interest group.
Done again.
Hi again. Yeah, Professor Sunstein, on what important occasions have you gone on the offensive against the governmentalization of social affairs, including standing, status quo, interventions, or programs? The reason I ask is you're kind of presenting yourself as classical liberal friendly, but I don't know of you doing that very much. So I'd be more convinced or persuaded if I were informed of your track record as actually promoting liberty.
Well, I don't thank you for that. I don't know if you read any of the news reports about my government experience, and I never talk about what was done internally that's not public. But most of the reports were that I was a strong opponent of regulation favored by the left, and repeatedly. There's been one rejection by a president of the United States, one, since a long time ago by any president of a regulation, and it was the President Obama's rejection of the EPA's ozone rule, and that was accompanied by a letter I wrote to the head of the EPA rejecting the ozone rule. The most aggressive deregulatory effort by the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs was through Executive Order 13563, the last of which was provision. It's called Retrospective Review of Regulations, and it produced lengthy documents reducing billions of dollars in regulatory costs. And that was an initiative that I oversaw. There's a burden reduction initiative ongoing in the current government. I wrote a book called Sludge, which is entirely devoted to the elimination of paperwork and other burdens. I've spent, but I don't want to talk about myself.
John.
Let's talk too much about myself. The amount of time I've spent on regulation reduction, I have a book called The Cost Benefit State, is much more than any human being should spend. I should have been playing tennis.
John Statham.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for that. There was a discussion about the relation between information and incentives. And it seems to me you are perhaps a little confident about the accuracy of information. I wrote a paper years ago where I suggested, for example, that societies depend on rules, but we don't know what those rules are until the society has either survived or crashed. So there's a lot of uncertainty about the long-term effects of things. And you see this sort of irrationality turning up in various places. Three places that come to mind. One is smoking, which is a lot of people would like to outlaw. A lot of money is made by the government from it. And yet smoking is much less dangerous to society as opposed to individuals than alcohol. But nobody, after prohibition, plans to get rid of alcohol. So those are two things. And finally, one that you alluded to is the issue of climate change. Now, I'm not a climate scientist, but I've read a fair amount about it, and there are a lot of very bright people who dispute the basic premise of climate change, namely that an increase in carbon dioxide is a bad thing, or will be a bad thing. So my general point is that a lot of the most important issues on which government makes rules and regulations are by their nature very, very uncertain. And in the face of such uncertainty, it seems to me it behooves government to keep out of it. Anyway, your thoughts?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So there are two things we could do. So Executive Order 13563, the last section is on retrospective analysis of rules, is very compatible with what you're saying. So let's say the cautious approach calls for ongoing evaluation and learning. The more nuclear approach is to say because of the epistemic challenges government faces and the propensity to error, we should have a rule utilitarian block on certain kinds of decisions. And there are assumptions under which the cautious and the nuclear approach are right. Speaking of cautious and nuclear, it is too perfect that I have a meeting in 2 minutes, journal to the government on things that are closely related to what we're now discussing. And having been instructed by you all, I should probably go to that meeting.
Thank you very much, Kat, for a great presentation. Hopefully next time we get you to talk about your manifesto on small L liberalism. Thank you.
That.
Thank
This
you,
has been
everybody.
a fantastic group, not least when it's been contentious.